The forge was the first thing she heard. Before she saw the town, before the wagon cleared the spruce line, there it was, a low, rhythmic strike moving through the cold air like a second heartbeat. Lachlan was at the anvil when she came through the door. He didn't look up. She stood in the entrance of the smithy with her coat still buttoned and her bag at her feet and waited. There was a child behind her, close enough that she could feel the small warmth of him at her back. She didn't look behind her, either. The man struck twice more, then set the hammer down across the anvil horn and turned. He was younger than she'd expected. The postmaster in Moose Jaw had said the blacksmith at Delwood the way you said the mountain or the river. Like something fixed and permanent that had always been there. This man had a young face under the soot. He looked at her, then past her at the boy, then back. She said she was answering the notice. The one posted at the feed merchant in town. He said he remembered posting it. She said she could work a bellows, and she could keep a ledger, and she could do whatever else he needed that didn't require her to be somewhere she wasn't. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said that was an unusual way to put it. She agreed that it was. He picked up a rag from the workbench and ran it over his hands and asked where she'd come from. She said east of Portage la Prairie, which was true. He didn't ask anything after that. He looked at the boy again, and then at her coat, and said there was a room above the feed room at the back, and that it was not warm, but it was dry. She asked what the work paid. He told her. She said that was fine. That was how it started. The smithy sat at the south edge of Delwood, which was not much of a town to begin with. A post office and a grain elevator, and a church that served 2 denominations on alternating Sundays. A hotel that had stopped taking travelers sometime in the previous decade but still kept its sign. The blacksmith shop was the only building with a chimney that smoked all year. She learned the schedule in the first week. He was at the forge before light. He stopped at midday for 20 minutes, no more. He finished when the work was finished, which was sometimes dark and sometimes not. She came to understand that this was not stubbornness. It was just how he was built, the boy. Her son, though she rarely introduced him as such because introductions led to questions, had turned 7 the previous March. His name was Emmett. He was quiet in the way that children become quiet when they have learned that noise draws attention, and attention is not always good. He sat in the corner of the feed room with whatever she'd found for him to do, and he did not bother the man. The man did not bother him either. On the 3rd day, she came in to find Lachlan had set a small stool near the far window, away from the heat and the sparks. She didn't say anything about it. Emmett used it without being told. She had not told anyone in Delwood where she had come from before Portage la Prairie. There had been a husband. There had been a farm south of Winnipeg that they'd broken together, she and that man, across 2 dry summers and one that was worse. There had been a particular morning in November when she woke before him and stood in the kitchen and understood, for the first time clearly, that she was afraid of the sound of him rising. After that, the understanding did not go away. She had left in February, which people who had never done it called the worst month for it. She knew it was the only month. The roads were hard and the boy did not ask questions and the cold kept other people inside. She did not think about that farm anymore. Or she tried not to. When she did, she thought about the stovepipe that had always drawn wrong and the way the west window had let in a fine sift of snow no matter what they packed around the frame. She thought about the small and broken things. That was easier. She kept the ledger. She swept the shop floor at the end of each day and sorted the finished pieces by order. She learned which suppliers he trusted and which he did not, and she wrote the orders herself, and he signed them without looking closely, which she thought was either trust or habit, and she was not sure there was much difference. He was a precise man. Not cold, precise. He did not use 2 words where one would do, and he did not do 2 passes with the hammer where one was enough. She noticed that he worked with a particular focus on the joint, on the place where 2 things had to hold together under pressure. He would do it over if the hold wasn't right, even when the piece looked finished. She understood that about him before she understood much else. In the 2nd week, Emmett's boot came apart at the sole. She had been meaning to get it resoled, but there had not yet been money for it, and she'd been stitching it herself with a length of waxed cord, and it kept failing. She was sitting at the workbench after hours, stitching it again, when Lachlan came back for something he'd left. He looked at the boot. He looked at her. He didn't say anything. In the morning, there was a small piece of shaped leather on the workbench beside the ledger. She recognized it as a cut-down offcut from a harness repair. She recognized the shape. He had cut it to the exact profile of the boot. She picked it up. She set it down. She went and got the boot and the waxed cord. It took her an hour. She did it right. There was a woman named Mrs. Dufresne who came in weekly for the structural work she kept commissioning for her house on the north side of town. Hinges, gate hardware, the kind of work that did not strictly require a blacksmith, but that she brought to one anyway. She was the type of woman who understood that paying for something well made was its own form of patience. She looked at the woman behind the counter, the first time with a careful sort of consideration that was not unfriendly. She said, "You're Lachlan's new girl." She said, "I work here, yes." Mrs. Dufresne said that was more or less what she meant. She ordered 2 new pintles for the garden gate, specified the weight, and left. She came back the following Wednesday with something wrapped in cloth. She set it on the counter and said it was a meat pie and that she'd made 2 and had no one to give the second one to, which they both understood was not entirely true. She did not make an occasion of it. She took it home and gave most of it to Emmett and ate the rest standing at the small stove in the room above the feed room. It was the best thing she had eaten in 4 months, and she did not let herself think about that too carefully. He asked her once where she'd learned to keep books. She said her father had kept a general store in Bruce County when she was young, and that she'd helped with the accounts from the time she was old enough to read a column. He said Bruce County, Ontario. She said yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said he had a cousin who had farmed near Walkerton once. She said that was not far. He said no, it wasn't. That was the longest conversation they'd had that was not about work. She thought about it later, not because it was remarkable, but because it was ordinary. She had not had an ordinary conversation in a long time. The trouble came in March, the way trouble in the north often does, quietly and from a direction you hadn't thought to watch. A man came into the shop on a Tuesday. He was from Red Deer originally by his accent, and he had been drinking, which she knew from the particular careful steadiness of his walk. He wanted a set of wagon springs priced, and she gave him the price, and he said that was too high, and she said that was the price. And he looked at her in the particular way that some men looked at women behind counters, assessing whether there was someone to complain to, someone in authority who might see things differently. He asked if the smith was about. She said the smith was at the back and she handled the front counter, and anything requiring the smith would come through her first. He said he'd rather deal with the man directly. She said she understood that, and that she'd let Lachlan know he had a customer, and that the price for the springs would not change. She went to the back and said there was a man at the counter who wanted to speak with him. She did not say anything else. Lachlan came through, wiped his hands, looked at the man, and asked what he needed. The man gave the price she'd quoted. Lachlan looked at her, then at the man, and said that was the right price, and she had his full authority on any quote she gave. The man bought the springs. Lachlan went back to the forge. He did not say anything to her about it. She did not say anything to him. She wrote the order in the ledger with the same pen she used for everything else. Spring came slow that year. The snow held through April, and there was still frost on the ground the first week of May. She had begun to know the town by then the way you came to know a place when you had decided at some level beneath thought that you were staying. She knew which families brought their horses in early for reshoeing, and which ones waited until the horse told them. She knew that the postmaster, a man named Wilder, had a bad hip and came in on wet mornings to stand near the forge for the heat, and that Lachlan always let him. She knew that there was a dispute between 2 farms to the northwest about a fence line, and that both of them ordered their ironwork from the shop, and that Lachlan managed to take neither side without appearing to avoid the question. She watched how he did that. She thought it was a skill, though not one he seemed aware of. He was just not the kind of man who found it useful to make enemies. Emmett had begun helping sweep the front step in the mornings. She had not asked him to. She had noticed one morning in April that it was done before she came downstairs, and then she noticed it was done every morning after that, and she understood that her son had found something he wanted to take care of. There was an evening in the second week of May that she thought about afterward for a long time. She had stayed late with the ledger because an order from the previous month had a discrepancy she was trying to find. Emmett was asleep upstairs. The fire had been banked, and the shop was cooling, and she was working by the lamp when she heard Lachlan come back in through the side door. He had gone to return a horse he'd borrowed to help move a lumber delivery. He stopped when he saw the lamp still burning. She said she was looking for something in the accounts from February. He sat down on the bench across the workbench from her without being invited, which was not something he had done before. He did not pick up anything or pretend to have a reason to be there. He just sat. She found the error. A supplier had transposed 2 figures and she had carried the wrong number forward. She corrected it. He said, "Did you find it?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He sat for a moment longer. Then he said, "I don't know how this place ran before you." She didn't say anything right away. She closed the ledger. She said she thought it ran fine. She said he had managed a long time before she arrived. He said managing and running well were not the same thing. She looked at him. He was looking at the ledger, not at her, which she thought was probably deliberate, giving her the chance to decide what to do with that without him watching. She said, "I have nowhere to go that's better than here." He said, "I'm not asking you to go anywhere." Outside, the wind had picked up and she could hear the spruce moving. She said she was glad to hear that. She said it simply, without the weight she felt behind it, because she had learned that you did not hand the full weight of a thing to someone before you knew if they were ready to hold it. He said he was glad too. That was all. She blew out the lamp and went upstairs. Emmett had kicked his blanket off and she put it back and stood for a moment in the dark and thought about what it felt like to be somewhere that no longer felt temporary. June came in warm, and she began keeping the front door of the shop propped open in the mornings. There was a smell she associated with that particular hour, cut metal and coal, and something underneath that was just the smell of the land waking up again after a long cold, and she found that she had begun to like it without deciding to. She had written to no one since arriving in Delwood. There was a sister in Ontario, but they had not been close in years, not since the sister had made clear, in the gentle way of people who believe they are being kind, that she thought the trouble in the marriage was something she might have managed differently. She did not have anger about that anymore. She just did not write. But in June, she took a sheet of paper from the back of the ledger and wrote a short letter. She described the town briefly. She described the shop. She described, carefully and without excess, the man who ran it. She described Emmett's boot and the leather offcut and did not explain why she was telling the story. She sealed the letter. She held it for 2 days. Then she gave it to Wilder at the post office and walked back down the road to the shop with her hands in her coat pockets and the sun on her face. She did not know if her sister would write back. She thought probably she would. People generally did when you finally gave them something real to respond to. There was a morning in late June when the hinges she had been meaning to fix on the feed room door finally gave out entirely. The door had been hanging wrong for weeks, dragging on the bottom, and she had been shimming it with a folded piece of cardboard, which had worked until it didn't. She came down the stairs that morning to find the door off its frame, leaning against the wall, and Lachlan crouched on the floor with a punch and a new set of hinge leaves laid out beside him. Emmett was crouched next to him, watching. Lachlan was explaining something about the placement of the holes, about where the weight of a door wanted to sit. He was using simple words. He was not talking down to the boy. He was just explaining it the way you explain something to someone who genuinely wanted to know. She stood on the stairs and watched for a moment. Emmett asked why you couldn't just put the hinge wherever you wanted. Lachlan said you could, but you'd be fighting the door every time you opened it, and there was no reason to fight something that would cooperate if you understood what it needed. Emmett thought about that. He said, "So you have to figure out where it wants to go." Lachlan said that was exactly right. She came down the rest of the stairs and went to put the kettle on. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that wasn't already hanging in the air of that room, obvious and clean as the morning light coming through the south window. She had not decided to stay in any single moment she could point to. That was the thing about it. There was no morning she'd woken up and made the choice. No conversation where someone had asked and she had answered. It had happened the way a door comes level, when you've finally set the hinge in the right place. Not with ceremony, just a settling, a point where the resistance stopped and the thing moved the way it was meant to move. She was there. Emmett was there. The ledger had her handwriting in it, back to October and forward through the orders she'd already placed for fall. On the last day of June, she rehung the feed-room door herself, while Lachlan was at the anvil and Emmett was at the school that Mrs. Dufresne had pointed out was not far, and Emmett had finally agreed to try. She set the hinges the way she had watched him do it. She checked the swing, the clearance at the bottom, the fit of the latch. The door moved without complaint. She stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then she went inside and washed her hands and opened the ledger to the page for July and wrote the date at the top of the column. Even though July had not started yet, she wrote it anyway. She was getting ready.